I mean, I could almost feel the darts in my back, and which wasn't pleasant, but it was like, hey, let's see how this works out. So that we were able to find donors to pay for it, and once we started raising a bit of the hubbub, we were able to raise more money. And there were quite a few op-eds written by the senators about, out-of-state group. It is also interesting because the chair of AFP Foundation was David Koch Industries in Wichita. I would hear Kansans saying, "Oh, well, this is an out-of-state group that's headed up by Koch." Well, Koch's in Wichita. It's not, you can't have it both ways there. And they would just blatantly be, I'm going to be polite here, misleading in their op-eds about, no, this tax increase doesn't do that, doesn't do this. I mean, it was a big tax increase. No two ways around it.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of American Potential. Thanks for being with us. How about these 3 words? Proposed tax hike. 3 words people don't like to hear because it means less money in their wallet. Well, in 2004, the governor of Kansas used these 3 words to deal with a budget shortfall and wanted to increase public school funding. Now, a group decided to let lawmakers know how much this proposed tax hike would hurt Kansas. So they talked to Kansans to get them to call their state officials and ask them to vote no. Now, this may not sound like anything new, but this group grew from having their first state chapter in Kansas to now having a presence in all 50 states. Now, since stopping the tax increase in Kansas, Americans for Prosperity has been working at all levels of government to help remove barriers so people can have the freedom and opportunity to pursue their version of the American dream. Now, on a previous episode, we've talked about the accomplishments of AFP and behind-the-scenes stories that happened over the past 20 years. But today, we want to go back to that first state chapter. I want to welcome my friend, Alan Cobb, who was the very first AFP state director. Now, we also want to mark a milestone for the podcast because this is our 200th episode, and we couldn't have made it this far without you, the viewer and the listener. So thanks for your support and your dedication to this show. We appreciate it a lot. Hey, Alan, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Happy to be here. Honored that I'm part of your 200th episode anniversary.
Yeah.
I guess anniversary
well,
is not the right word.
It's not even that you're part of it. You're apparently it. I mean, you are it. I mean, you are our 200th episode, man. So congrats. We had to do something special. First of all, you are the guy that hired me at Americans for Prosperity. I want to tell that story real quick. I mean, you called me because we were doing some rallies in Colorado and I was kind of helping you put those together. And you said, hey, would you fly to Kansas and meet with us? So I flew to Kansas City. We met in the airport and we never even left the airport, met in the airport. And then I flew home. And when I landed, I had a call from you and you guys offered me the job. The rest is history. But so thank you. I owe it all to you, Alan, my friend.
Well, thank you. It was an easy decision. And technically, the airport is in Missouri. So that makes Kansas City, Missouri very irritated when you land and they'll say that going into the commercial airport and the pilot will say, welcome to Kansas, and half the plane starts grunting.
That's right. Well, good. Well, thank you thanks for joining us. And thanks too for that, obviously taking on a guy like me, you took a chance. It shows that you're willing to take a risk. I appreciate that. Let's talk about let's talk about what it was like during the early days of before the tax increase engagement. Let's talk about that. Like, was AFP around? How did it all form? Let's talk about that.
Well, it was AFP AFP got started basically around February, March of '04, and it was the result of Citizens for a Sound Economy and Citizens for a Sound Economy Foundation basically splitting apart. There were some various types of disagreements, and it's obviously both nonprofits, and then CSE became AFP, and there was just the decision to make, let's have a chapter in Kansas. And CSE was not really chapter focused, except for a couple of states. They were more involved in federal policy, and the board leadership decided to start the chapters, and so I was the consultant that was hired to help them get started. And there was always the question, okay, because I was just on a consulting basis, how serious are we? Can we raise the money to actually have a chapter? Can we make a difference? Can we do anything? And that was actually kind of a question when you have a tax increase being proposed in Kansas. We did have a Democratic governor, but Kansas is pretty red. We're not Oklahoma or West Virginia, but it's pretty red. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning.
Yeah,
in 2 minutes.
Yeah. Why was the tax increase issue the one that you decided to get involved with?
We actually started out getting involved in taxpayer bill of rights, and that's just, which obviously you know all about that being a Coloradan. That's hard to get done, and we were literally trying to figure out, okay, is there a pathway forward? Can we have an impact on fiscal policy? And a little bit of a surprise, some Republicans joined with all of the Democrats in the Kansas House, and they passed a fairly large tax increase, and it caught everybody off guard, including House leadership, which were Republicans, and said, well, this is almost a test case. Let's see if we can get this killed in the Senate. And then we put the strategy together to kill it in the Senate, end of March, early April, something like that. And we were successful, but it was certainly not always, it wasn't always clear that we were going to be successful.
So this is always something that has, that number one, drew me to AFP, right, to Americans for Prosperity. But something that's always intrigued me, Americans for Prosperity is a principled organization, right? That like here you were to hold Republicans accountable for passing a tax increase or trying to pass a tax increase. And that's just not something that had been done a whole lot, right? People just fell along party lines. And if you're a Republican, people just kind of went along. If you're Democrat, you went along. This was kind of a new experiment, right? I mean, how did people take to that? How did legislators like that?
They did not like it. And so I was, which is a polite way to say I was a lobbyist. I had other clients.
Right.
And you would have thought that, and I never hesitated. It's like, this is a tax increase. This ought not to be controversial. You may not agree with opposing the tax increase, but it shouldn't be controversial. But just the way I was treated by Capitol insiders, who are still my friends, but it was like I sent pictures, explicit photos around or something. It was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did it. Because no one ever wants to, and particularly lobbyists, you have to be a little cautious about upsetting legislators. But I remember being a little perplexed and even talking to some legislators said, look, we're simply opposing a tax increase. We're not trying to shut down government. You can like it or dislike it, but it shouldn't be controversial.
Yeah.
And so the legislators didn't like it, but so we lit up phones, did a direct mail. We did not do TV. We did radio. And it was so fun and funny to listen to the debate because that was really the first time anybody had done a in-session issue campaign to that degree when you're trying to lobby for or against a bill. And so legislators were caught off guard having their constituents get all these postcards and then to have phone numbers on the postcards, phone numbers and email. And I remember a state senator said, well, I know we're all complaining about these postcards, but they sure seem to me to be working because I've gotten more calls on this than in all my previous years in the Kansas Senate. So now it happens a lot more. It's partly easier to do issue campaigns because of all the digital stuff. And who knows what's going to happen with artificial intelligence? You won't even need live callers. You'll just have AI generated voices, I guess. But we had radio ads simply opposing the tax increase. and Kansas was in a competitive disadvantage to a lot of our neighboring states, and it simply wasn't needed. There, I think you mentioned at the beginning a budget shortfall. Well, I guess it was a budget shortfall because of the governor's proposed budget, but there were not budgets being cut, and it's the old rate reduction of increase. We had those debates, but it was fun. And I looking back, I mean, I don't know that I had too much trepidation, but I guess now I'm thinking of a story that, because it was controversial among insiders and others, and I know the president of the Kansas Senate didn't like it, and I understood why, because he thought it was going to put the election chances of his fellow Republicans in harm's way because they were being exposed for voting for tax increases. And I got a call at home from a state legislator and said, she was very upset. She goes, "Well, Alan, you know where I live in Johnson County. I mean, I have to vote for it." I said, "Well, then vote for it." I said, "Yeah, but I don't want people to know I voted for it." I said, "Gee, I'm having a hard time with this." And so one of my predecessors, I'm now president of the Kansas Chamber, one of my predecessors, Lou Ebert, he had called me a little worried about me because my name was being taken in vain by the Senate president. And I just kind of said, whatever. Of course, that was 20 years ago when I was in my 30s. Yeah. I said, I'm not too worried. I'm going to be around a lot longer than he is.
Right.
And then he announced his retirement 2 weeks later. and here's what I'm doing. And I will go back to, it was just a tax increase we were opposing.
Yeah.
So, but people got kind of went bananas. They kind of lost their minds about it.
One of the things, though, that AFP has always stood for, and I think it has great value, and you speak to that in this example that you gave, is just, being principled, but not being nasty, not being mean. This was never personal, right? You were just trying to get them to vote in a principled way. And if they weren't, you were going to hold them accountable, but not in a mean, nasty way that we see so often in politics today. But the thing that I love about Americans for Prosperity, and have been a part of it for many years now, is that they have never employed kind of the negative, nasty tactics of it. They've always been respectful in their discourse. And I mean, you clearly, this was at the very beginning of the organization as you're talking about this particular tax issue as well.
Yeah. Now, people at that time did not think it was polite. But I remember the postcards, and it simply had a picture of the legislator. Some of them had already voted for a tax increase, and we put that in the postcard. Right. Senator so-and-so has already voted for one tax increase. When he or she has a chance to call them or email them and tell them to vote no. That was basically that a picture. It wasn't the world is getting end or pictures of lightning strikes or anything. I mean, we do get accused of, or AFP has gotten accused of that, but it's like that folks are maybe skin is a little too thin. But I think that's always been important, is be factual and firm. Yeah.
So social media, and you alluded to this, social media wasn't around then, or is in its infancy, I suppose. How'd you find people to talk about the tax increase?
We basically did the old-fashioned stuff, looked at Republican primary voters, and people who voted 3 out of the last 4, we just mailed it to them in the districts. So that was the mailer. And on phone calls, we used the same thing, used the database of the voter file. And then I think that was, you could buy email lists then. And surely we probably did that. But I know most of it was just plain and simple voter files, which I know databases are so much more sophisticated now that you can get exactly who you want to. Because I'm sure we wasted a bunch of money, that a bunch of people didn't make the phone calls. But enough people made a phone call that it killed the tax increase.
Right. So do you remember what people would say about the tax increase when you talked to them about it? Like just average citizens?
They were just angry. And stuff. It was like, no, we don't need to raise taxes. And taxes in Bill Graves was the previous governor. And Sebelius got elected in 2002. So 3 of Bill Graves' last 4 years, there was a tax increase of one kind or another. So Kansas voters really, new governor and more tax increases. So there was just some folks that were, a lot of voters just, well, they don't, I think it stays true today, right? That's one of the easiest issues sometimes to come on, because voters don't need some fancy explanation about interest rates or, oh, no, the budget has only gone up this amount or whatever. It's like, no, they're taxed enough. And whatever body it is, school board, state, local, federal folks, it's an easy issue to communicate.
Yeah. So you talked about this too, but lawmakers, this was really the first time you kind of employed these tactics, as you said. Right. What did you hear from state lawmakers? I mean, obviously you thought some of them thought that the sky was falling and the world was ending. What'd you hear from them?
Well, the ones who voted against it thought we were the cavalry coming in. I mean, voted against tax increase, that we're all on the same side.
Right.
Because usually I think some of those folks, like, they were kind of alone, that kind of the establishment or the kind of the spending caucus isn't usually with them. So, and then the folks that voted against it, I had legislators that were calling my other clients to get me fired. So,
really?
Yeah, I'd call that political retribution. And,
I would say, yeah.
Yeah, and so it depends on the legislators. But again, all we were doing was letting voters know that there's a tax increase vote coming, and call your legislators to tell them no. And if you don't like that, think that's something like dogs and cats living together, then I don't have any sympathy for you.
Yeah, right. You find this in states like Kansas. So Kansas certainly not as red as it once was, but still a red state. I mean, what is your legislative makeup today? I mean, you guys
supermajority Republican.
Right, supermajority Republican. But you find this in a lot of states where there are, I mean, I'm sure Democrats find it too, where they're heavily Democrat states. But in heavily Republican states where it's kind of one party rule, they lose principle pretty easy. Like you see legislators just start voting for tax increases and arguing that government needs more money. This was one of the first stands against that in a Republican state. Would you agree?
Oh, yes. And it's the Republicans many times. It's like, well, they want their Republican projects. And it's not unlike, it's very disappointing to see members of Congress talking about a Republican-oriented industrial policy. How about we don't have an industrial policy yet? Let the markets figure all that out. So, yeah, yes, you kind of get, you don't get challenged. Republicans are going to win in a state like Kansas. And then you have some of the folks that would come right out and say it. I guess you'd say the more moderate, because, well, why aren't you just a Democrat? Well, I couldn't get elected if I was a Democrat. And I'm remembering there was a conservative-ish Democrat in central Kansas. I suppose that where Kansas has changed is there used to be Democrats in rural Kansas, and there essentially aren't anymore. And now Johnson County, the biggest county, is becoming more purple. Anyway, there was a Democrat in central Kansas, probably a centrist. And I had folks in her district who I knew calling me that didn't believe me that she'd voted for these tax increases. Oh, because Senator Lee doesn't vote for tax increases. She tells us she doesn't. I said, I have the House, or I have the Senate Journal. I'm going to happy to send it to you.
Yeah.
So I think there was that from and because there weren't groups like AFP and others that were holding legislators accountable during the legislative session or during the election season, legislative candidates could say, yes, I'm for tax cuts. And what I think was interesting, that the Kansas was more conservative than the folks they were electing to the legislature.
Right.
And now I think it's a closer reflection of both some shifts in both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's always people at the legislature that are there to support a particular tax increase, right? Because it benefits their industry, right? Or a community that wants a tax increase for transportation projects, or, somebody wants an advantage. But prior to this, there really hadn't been anyone there in an organized way with money and an effort behind them to actually defend the taxpayers and fight against these tax increases. It must have been a wild scene for people to see this.
Oh, yeah. Again, it was people very, very upset and very, very, very happy. And it just, but I say again, walking into the Capitol after the mail hit, I mean, I could almost feel the darts in my back, and which wasn't pleasant, but it was like, hey, let's see how this works out. So that we were able to find donors to pay for it. And once we started raising a bit of the hubbub, we were able to raise more money. And there were quite a few op-eds written by the senators about, out of state group. It is also interesting because the chair of AFP Foundation was David Koch, Koch Industries in Wichita. I would hear Kansans saying, "Oh, well, this is an out of state group that's is headed up by Koch." Well, Koch's in Wichita, so you can't have it both ways there.
Right.
And they would just blatantly be, I'm going to be polite here, misleading in their op-eds about, no, this tax increase doesn't do that, doesn't do this. I mean, it was a big tax increase. But there was no two ways around it. Also, I remember this is going to sound odd. Went to the funeral of a state senator, and he had died in a car accident. And the Democratic leader kind of accosted me, and I just said, "Hey, Dennis, I couldn't defend everything that we put in there and having defend my name on it, but I'm not going to talk about it here."
Right.
And that's how some of the folks were.
Gosh.
And he also then, I think he was concerned about putting his Democrat legislative candidates in harm's way because it's being exposed if they're voting for a tax increase.
Right.
If you don't want to put them in harm's way, then don't bring the bill up to the floor.
Right. Yeah, there's a way to be a champion on this issue or to not be, and the way to be a champion is to vote against it, right? I mean, it's just easy, simple stuff. So we talked about the tax increase stuff, but tell me a couple of you've got to have some crazy stories. Well, I know you have some crazy stories of things that were happening during the start of the state chapter of Americans for Prosperity in Kansas.
Well, yeah. So one, there wasn't any real guidebook. I mean,
Right.
Having grassroots and campaigns, there's a lot of guidebooks about that. But how do you really start a movement on an issue? Mm-hmm. And it took a while to figure it out, and then decided to do. We did a kind of a campaign school. And so did a campaign school as a way to say, for those of you that are interested in affecting public policy, and here's what AFP is, and here are these new things we're going to do. And so we went to Dodge City. For those of you that don't know Kansas, Dodge City is a real place. It's not just a place for movies. I like Dodge City. The history is incredible. Anyway, that was one of our biggest crowds because no one knew AFP. How are we going to promote it? And it was 40 pit bull owners because the city of Dodge City was considering banning pit bulls ownership. And they wanted to learn how to fight, kind of fight the man. And decided we'd start local chapters because just as a way to keep things going and keep people energized. And we'd have local chapter meetings. And there's a town in western Kansas, Hayes, which there's an example of used to be Democrat, now it's not. Anyway, usually would spend $500 on radio, do a newspaper ad, and we'd get, in some of the smaller towns, 10, 15, 20 people. And so they're just this is very early, just trying to get something going, get more and more folks interested, and get legislators there. Well, there in Hayes, I had one lady show up, and I had started inviting the press because at first I wasn't inviting the press because I want to make sure we're getting people here.
Yeah.
So yes, the Hayes Daily News shows up, and I said, "Can you do me a favor and don't say one person? Can you just describe it as a small crowd?"
Yeah.
And they did. So they did me, and it was a small crowd.
Yeah.
And don't know if we went back to Hayes for a while. So.
The next time you went back, you doubled the crowd size, I would assume.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And, I often think of this because you're telling some of these stories, and I hear people today sort of act like, they're the rabble rousers or whatever. Well, where were you? Because, this organization's been around 20 years now. And I mean, you were at that fight. As I said, I think this was the first time, in Kansas history, it sounds like, where somebody was there advocating for the taxpayer, advocating against a tax increase, advocating against government growing in size and scope.
Advocating gets it in a campaign style. I'm sure there are folks that would lobby or testify, right?
Sure,
but
right.
Not the full, kind of full accountability.
Yeah,
and,
right.
So there were some other, I think, kind of anti-tax groups that had been around, but didn't have the success and kind of looked at as anti-government. And as consumers, we always have to fight that. Does that mean no? I'm just for more efficient, more effective government.
Right.
And kind of had to so we were able to change the message in a more positive, proactive way.
Right.
So talking about growth and how can Kansas be more competitive, et cetera.
Right. So when you, essentially when you all started AFP, did you ever think that the organization would grow to what it is today? I mean, you probably could never have imagined that.
Probably not, although it doesn't surprise me, given the folks that it has attracted and the leaders and donors and volunteer leaders. I guess it doesn't surprise me, but I would not have had that vision to be in all 50 states and be effective on the federal level with candidates and campaigns, and be effective at the federal level on policy, because we were so state focused at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I didn't see any of that coming, but again, it's not surprising. You have folks like you and others that led the organization to those heights, and now there's a good track record, and obviously there's been a track record, which is why it's 20 years, and there's no question in my mind we'll be looking at 25 and 30. Yeah.
Yeah. You've gotten to do a lot of different things, Alan. I mean, you've been you run the Kansas State Chamber now. You worked for the Trump campaign years ago. You were a candidate yourself. I mean, you've gotten to do a lot of really cool things. How would you put this sort of startup and this? I mean, it's almost it just was a very grassroots, begin from the bottom type effort fighting this tax increase. Where would you put that in the level of things you've gotten to do?
Oh, top 5, I suppose.
Right.
I mean, there's been things like I was an election observer in Ukraine in 2014. That was pretty cool, right?
Yeah, right.
But that's also a 10-day deal.
Right.
The fighting the tax increase and establishing the AFP, I think, has made a difference in my home state of Kansas that I care about. So that was, it's certainly way up there.
Yeah. Hiring me at AFP, maybe the top 100? Top 100? 200.
Possibly.
Maybe 200. Let's go 200.
It'd be top 10. I don't know.
No, it wouldn't be top 10. You'd have too boring of a life if that was top 10. Anyway, awesome. Alan, hey, thanks for joining us. I appreciate you joining us and sharing some of that history. I think this is interesting for people who are listening to the podcast, maybe have never heard of Americans for Prosperity or heard of an organization starting like this. Hopefully it will inspire others. I mean, there's no reason why some other effort like this can't lead to an outcome just as exceptional as AFP has been. But I think it's also interesting for the people who currently, like, let's say, work at Americans for Prosperity or know about it or a donor to it, that this is how it started. That history is important so that they continue to stay tethered to those roots. So I appreciate you being with us.
And that's a great description of it. I'm honored to be asked.
Yeah. Okay, buddy. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Listen, we talked about Alan and, this effort and the grassroots nature of it. And that's how freedom and liberty is defended day by day. People, citizens, ordinary citizens, step up and decide that's what they're going to do. They're going to make a stand, or they find an injustice in their community and they decide they're going to use their skills and their talents to fix that injustice in their community. And that's how change is made, and that's how liberty and freedom continue to thrive. Go out there, defend freedom, defend liberty. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.